Hello students, welcome back with the Standard 12th chapter number 2 discussion, and I welcome you all for the next session. We are discussing about the sexual reproduction in flowering plants, and today's topic is pollination. I have given you the basic introduction of pollination in the previous class, where we came to know that what is the process, what is the definition of the process. Pollination is a process where the process of transferring of the anther to the stigma. What is getting transferred from anther to the stigma? The pollen grains. So the process of transferring the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma, from one flower to the other flower, or of the same flower but of the same species, is called as pollination. Right? Now I hope you recall what we are talking about. So let us see what exactly we have in this chapter, next part as it is. Okay. So sexual reproduction in flowering plant. These are the initial slides, and we also know this chapter has a lot of importance. I have told you so many times. So let us see what we have next. Okay. This slide only is coming back again and again. Yeah. Now today's class will be talking about that pollination contrivances for cross-pollination. I told you in the previous session that compared to self-pollination, cross-pollination is preferred, right? Why cross-pollination is preferred? Because in a cross-pollination, the chances of variations are more, right? So the the flowering plant will be getting a more better variety, more mixing of the characters in a better way, so that this cross pollination is always preferred compared to self pollination. So nature always prefers cross pollination if we talk about self pollination and compare them, both of them. Because sometimes what happens, because of self pollination, there comes a inbreeding depression. What is inbreeding depression? We'll be learning more about it when we talk about strategies of food production and enhancement in the future chapters with second PUC or in 12th standard. But here I'll tell you a little bit about inbreeding depression, because here we are going to talk about something called as outbreeding. Before knowing about what is outbreeding, let me tell you briefly about what is inbreeding. Inbreeding means when same organisms is repeatedly getting fertilized by the same type of gene, then that is called as inbreeding. There is no variety that is going on. Okay, now for example, if I talk about in case of plant itself, as we're talking about plants, let us think that the plant is self-pollinating. Okay, what is that? The plant is self-pollinating. Now what happens in self-pollinating plant? You know that in self-pollination plant, the flower, if there is a flower, and in the flower there will be the stigma, then there will be the female reproductive part, and there will be the male reproductive part, which will be carrying the anther, right? Now what happens in self-pollination? The anther is depositing on the stigma itself, right? So the characteristics of this plant is present in the anther, as well as the same characteristic is getting transferred to the stigma, and it is getting fertilized. So whenever there is a seed formation, the plant is not showing any variation, because the same plant characteristics is going on. This is called as inbreeding. Okay, this is called as inbreeding. Now, inbreeding is okay. Why inbreeding is okay? Because if we wanted to make a clone of a particular plant, then inbreeding is fine, because we want to take the same characteristics. Got it? But imagine inbreeding is happening generation after generation in one particular plant. Then what will happen? There will be no characters mixing, and those plants may suffer from some of the particular losses in their characteristics in such a way that they cannot sustain in the changing world. That is why variation is very important. And for variation, what is important? Cross-pollination, right? So that is why nature chooses cross-pollination over self-pollination. And to stop this inbreeding depression, we call it as inbreeding depression. Why depression? Because the same characters get repeated and repeated. There is no variation which is taking place. Because of that, the plant loses its capacity to be alive only maybe after a few generations. That to avoid that depression, outbreeding or cross-pollination is very important. You have to understand this concept very clearly, that when a plant can reproduce by self-pollination only, then why the plant is going for cross-pollination? Like they have to make a special type of flower for cross-pollination. They have to be specific for anemophily, hydrophily, entomophily type of flowers. They should be having different variation. Why? Because to sustain in the changing world, sustain the changing environment, these variations are very much important. Without the variations, it is impossible to go forward and to sustain on the earth's surface. So to accept the evolution, to go for further, to keep the generations alive, cross-pollination is always preferred compared to self-pollination. Is it clear to you? So that is why nature always prefers cross-pollination on self-pollination. And in order to prevent self-pollination and increase the chances of cross-pollination, flowers develop several adaptations. The flower will start developing several adaptation techniques for that. Okay. And what are those techniques? Those techniques are very special because those techniques are really required so that they can go for outbreeding. Right. So that is called as inbreeding depression. And let us see what else we have. Such adaptation which help in increasing the chances for cross-pollination are called as contrivances for cross-pollination, or it is called as outbreeding devices, or what it is called as? It is called as outbreeding devices. What is the meaning of it? Outbreeding devices means the ways a plant is stopping itself to go for self-pollination. The ways a plant is stopping itself to go for self-pollination, that is called as outbreeding devices. That means they are not allowing the plant to go for self-pollination only. That is called as cross-pollination. Let us know some of the outbreeding devices and see, this is outbreeding is very easy topic to understand because plant is adapting something so that they should not have a self-pollination. Now, how do they adapt it? What are the techniques they follow? That is important. And you have to remember those terms. That's all. Okay. Let us see one more time. What exactly are those adaptations are? Now, the first one is called as unisexuality, or which is also called as decline. Decline is the condition where the flowers becomes unisexual. If the flowers becomes unisexual, then the chances of reproducing the flower by itself becomes less. Okay, na? So this is the condition where the flowers becomes unisexual, and this is one of the outbreeding technique. In this way, if the flower is unisexual, like as we see in case of papaya plant, the flower itself is unisexual. They have a separate male flower, they have a separate female flower, right? So when the flower becomes unisexual, at that time, male and female flower is different, and that is why they can go for a cross-pollination only. The pollination cannot happen by self-pollination. It has to be a cross-pollination only. When the plants are monoecious, autogamy is prevented. When the plant is monoecious, then we avoid autogamy, but geitonogamy cannot be avoided if a plant is monoecious. Okay, as we see in case of maize and castor, what happens when the plants are monoecious? Autogamy is not possible. Why the autogamy is not possible? Because they cannot reproduce by putting the anther to the stigma. The flowers itself are different, right? So when the plants are monoecious, autogamy can be avoided, but geitonogamy cannot be avoided, as we see the example at maize and castor. Okay. But when the plant becomes dioecious, what is the meaning of dioecious plant? In case of dioecious plant, male plant and female plant itself is separate. When the plant becomes dioecious, self-pollination is prevented and only cross-pollination is possible, as we see in case of papaya. What is happening now? When the plant becomes dioecious, we have a separate male plant and a separate female plant. You will observe it very carefully. If you observe very carefully, you will see that male papaya plants, flowers will not have the ovary part itself. They will be tapered at the end. The flower itself will be completely different looking compared to a female flower. And obviously the male plant will not have any fruit produced of it, right? Because they don't have ovary, right? If they don't have the ovary, how the fruit will be produced? So when the plant becomes dioecious, self-pollination is completely avoided. This is one of the very best way to avoid self-pollination. See, if the plant become dioecious. But in nature, it is not always possible to become a dioecious plant. Like they should have a separate male plant and a female plant. So it is possible that in the same plant, there is a male flower and a female flower. That is possible. But in that case also, autogamy can be avoided. J-tenogamy cannot be avoided. Because J-tenogamy, I hope you remember that on the same flower, there's the same plant is there. There is a one flower over here, and on the same plant, one more flower is present over here. Correct now. So this is possible. Like the transferring from the anther to the stigma from one flower to the other flower is possible. So in this case, though it is to some extent avoided, but not completely. Clear? So this is called as unisexuality or dichlyny. In dichlyny, what happens? There is a chances of the flower itself or the plant itself to become unisexual, and they avoid self-pollination and go for cross-pollination. This is one of the very important outbreeding devices. Let us see the next one, that is called as dichogamy. What is dichogamy means? This is the condition where anthers and stigma matures at different times. What is dichogamy? This is a very important technique. See, as I told you, in nature, it is not possible for all the flowers to be unisexual. So at that time, what they do, there may be a bisexual flower present. If the flower is bisexual, then androecium and gynoecium both are present. If androecium and gynoecium both are present, then in that case, how they can avoid this? How they can avoid self-pollination? The maturity time will be different. Anther will be maturing before the stigma matures, or the stigma will be maturing before the anther matures. So what happens? If at all by chance the anthers falls on the stigma also, the pollination will not happen because it is not matured early. Did you get it? So that is one of the other way of avoiding self-pollination and go for cross-pollination. One of the very important outbreeding devices. See, that's what I'm telling. Either the anthers mature and release. So once the anthers get mature, it will be released. For example, if a flower is blooming, first the anther will mature, maybe 6 to 10 hours before the stigma matures, anther is matured, anther will fall off, it will be taken by the insects or something, and the anther is not at all active now. So anther has matured before the stigma was matured. So either the anthers are mature and releases the pollen grain before the stigma becomes receptive. Before the stigma is ready to accept the anther is already removed. So what happens now? Obviously, self-pollination is not possible. They have to go by cross-pollination. Or the stigma becomes receptive first. Stigma will become receptive first. It may get pollinated before, and then the anther is getting reproduced before the release of the pollen grain, right? Okay, so this is the one which will be showing, this diagram will be showing you that how this technique is possible. Let me show you in a proper way. Let us go for that particular slide where we have this. Yeah. Now, what it is called as? It is called as Protandry and Protogamy. Okay, Protandry and Protogamy. Now, okay, observe the diagram very carefully. You will understand it very easily. Here, the anther is getting dissected or falling off. The anther is falling off much before the stigma is becoming receptive. Okay, so now what is happening? The anther is ready, it is fallen off, and then the stigma is becoming receptive. This is one condition. What is the other condition? The stigma is receptive first. The stigma is receptive first, then the anther is getting matured. Okay, so these are the two cases where one says anther is getting matured, in the other case, the stigma is getting matured. So now let us see what are these things called as, right? See what is happening. I hope you got it now. Either the anther is getting matured earlier or the stigma is getting matured earlier. As I told you, there's Protandry and Protogamy. Let us see the naming of them. Okay, now if the definition comes, generally in competitive exams you may get this type of question. Maturation and releasing of pollen grains much earlier to the stigma becoming receptive is called as Protandry. So what is Protandry? In case of Protandry, what is happening? The male reproductive part is getting matured. Male reproductive part is getting matured. That means we can say that the anther is getting matured earlier than the stigma. What happens in the other case? It is called as Protogamy. What it is called as? It is called as Protogamy. Okay. In Protogamy, what is happening? The female part the female reproductive part or the stigma is getting matured earlier than that. What it is getting matured? Stigma is getting matured earlier than the anther. Did you get it? So on this way we can classify them in protandry,